Yeah, so I'm going to talk about honesty in public health communication. And the first thing to say is I'm very sorry that I can't be there in person. I had a brilliant time there last year. And the reason for my absence is this person. So this is Edie, and she was born weeks ago. Um, and I was too cowardly to either bring her with me or leave her behind. So that's why I'm still in Oxford rather than in North Carolina, enjoying the all you can eat free ice cream and the wonderful conversations that we're having. And there is some possibility, because this is the first time that she's really spent an extended period of time not on top of me. So there's some possibility that she might arrive back at any moment and I'll have to do a quick feed or similar. But hopefully that won't happen and we can get through this presentation without the interruption of a baby. But onto the talk. So last year, I tried to kind of give kind of an overview of the different work that we've been doing as part of this project. And the project is about honesty in public health communication, and the core kind of questions that we were looking at were what honesty involves in public health communication. So particularly when you're communicating to large and diverse audiences and people with limited health literacy. What does honesty actually look like? What does it mean to be honest? And the other question was whether or not honesty is actually required of public health communicators. So we did various different kind of sub-projects within that, and there was kind of more conceptual, philosophical work, there was some descriptive empirical work, and then there was the kind of ethical normative work, which tried to kind of draw conclusions about what we ought to be doing in the context of public health communication. So rather than kind of repeating all of that again, and I haven't really done that much since the project wrapped up, because this project really finished last August. I was going to kind of shift the focus a little bit, and I want to say a bit more about some of the empirical work that we did, and then focus on our experiences with publishing that work. So it's a bit of an unusual kind of talk, but I thought it might be interesting to kind of highlight some of the issues that we had when it came to publishing this work. So I'll describe the empirical work we did first in kind of brief terms, and then turn to some of the discussions around publication. So the work we did involved looking at online public health communications. So we did a Google search. So my collaborator on this work was Mihal Dabara, and he's a psychologist, a social sciences. He does quite a lot of kind of quantitative health research work. So we looked at 10 different health areas, and we did Google searches of these terms with kind of health in there as well. And then we took the first 9 hits on Google for each of these areas. And we went to the landing page and we looked at all of the different health claims that were made on that page. And so we ended up with a data set of about 2,500 different health claims relating to alcohol, breastfeeding, diet, obesity, the things on the slide there. And then we coded them for various different things. And I'm not going to talk about all of them, but two of the things that we coded were scientific certainty or uncertainty. So we looked at whether the health claim was qualified with the degree of scientific certainty or uncertainty that was associated with it. So whether the health claim was kind of very robust and we're very confident in it, or whether there's a lack of evidence and we're not really sure, but this is our best guess. And we also looked at the way that effect sizes were provided. So when the health claims were describing a benefit or a harm of some kind of health behavior or intervention, we looked at whether or not they provided a numerical effect size for that benefit or harm. So did they say how much this is going to benefit or harm you? So we're looking for this kind of quantification of effect sizes. And secondarily, we looked at when they did quantify the effect size, the format that they presented that in. So whether or not they presented it as an absolute risk or a frequency, or whether they presented it in terms of a relative risk. And so the results that we got from this coding were that very rarely did scientific uncertainty or certainty get mentioned alongside the health claims. So overall, it was about 3% of the 2,500 health claims that were qualified with any degree of certainty. And this was it was more common to get some indication of the robustness of the scientific evidence when they were talking about harms versus when they were talking about benefits. So about 11% of harms were qualified with some level of certainty or uncertainty, but only 2.5% of benefits were qualified in this way. Turning to the effect sizes, so it was relatively unusual for effect sizes to be quantified at all. So we found that most effect sizes were only provided in kind of qualitative terms. So they would say this is very beneficial for your health, or this significantly reduces your risk of heart disease, or those kinds of terms, that kind of language. But it was quite unusual to find that there was actually a number attached to it. But when we looked at the subset of health claims that did come alongside a numerical effect size, and when we looked at the format of that effect size, of that numerical effect size, we found that harms were much more likely to be presented in terms of absolute risk or frequency than benefits were. So about 70% of harms were presented as a kind of an absolute risk effect size, whereas only 16% of benefits were presented as in the format of an absolute risk. So it's much more common for benefits to be presented as a relative risk than it was for harms. And relative risk, for those who don't know, is when you say that something doubles your risk of heart disease, or it reduces your risk by a half. Those kinds of things are kind of relative risk. So they're relative to your initial risk. Whereas absolute risk tells you, it gives you information about the kind of the baseline risk. So if you give someone risk information in the form of a frequency, say you tell them that your risk of heart disease if you don't exercise is 1 in 100. I'm just inventing these numbers. Whereas your risk of heart disease if you exercise 3 times a week for 30 minutes at moderate intensity is 1 in 500. So that would be giving frequency, so people can tell what their risk moves from to in absolute terms. And the reason that this is important is that relative risks can exaggerate how meaningful a risk change is. So if your risk changes from 0.01% to 0.02%, then it's doubled, but it's still a very small risk. And what we found was that in public health communications, there was a lot of use of this kind of relative risk presentation in the context of the benefits of health interventions, which looks likely to exaggerate how important those benefits are. And what perhaps is more significant is that you would get a pairing of a benefit framed in terms of relative risks with a harm framed in terms of absolute risks. So absolute risks often look quite small because they are things like 1 in 100, 1 in 1,000. And so they look kind of insignificant when you set them up alongside relative risks, which are like doubled or increased by 100%, or those kinds of things. So you get what we call mismatched reporting. I shouldn't imply that we invented the term, like other people have written about this as well. So you get mismatched reporting where the communicator talks about the benefits of an intervention in relative risk terms, and they talk about the harms of the intervention in absolute risk terms. So they perhaps kind of emphasize the benefits and minimize the harms in some way, and they exaggerate the tendency to overestimate things that are described in relative risks and underestimate things that are described in absolute risks. So this is one of the kind of more important findings of this empirical work. I do have another slide that I was not going to skip. No, I don't. Anyway, so the overall kind of finding of this empirical work was that the public health communicators tended to provide no quantitative information at all when they're describing the health effects of interventions and particular behaviours. But when they do provide quantitative information, they tend to provide it in these perhaps somewhat misleading ways. More often than providing quantitative information at all, though, what they tend to do is just provide really long lists of the health harms of, say, obesity or alcohol consumption or smoking. So they provide, I think these were all of the health effects that we found, all the health claims that we found associated with obesity across the websites that we looked at. So I think there were 177 different health claims associated with obesity. But remember, like, it was unusual for quantitative risk information to be presented alongside this. So you'd get these lists of irregular periods, joint pain, kidney cancer, kidney damage, kidney disease, leukemia, lipid abnormalities, liver cancer, liver disease, these kinds of things, but you wouldn't get told how much obesity increases your risk of suffering from these kinds of conditions. So that's really all I wanted to say in terms of kind of summarizing the empirical work we did. I forgot to put I should have put the citation on the slides, apologies for that, but this is published as a paper and it's published in Nature Human Behavior. It's de Barrett and Brown are the authors. And I'm going to talk a little bit now about the process of getting it published. So we submitted to Nature Human Behavior because we were quite keen to reach an audience of kind of behavioral scientists and people who weren't just professional ethicists or philosophers, which is what you'll get if you're lucky when you submit to a philosophy journal. So we wanted to reach a wider audience. It was submitted as a comment piece, so we had a very tight word limit. So I am more used to writing philosophy papers where you probably get kind of average between 7,000 or 8,000 to 10,000 or 11,000 words to play with. And I think the word limit for this was around 2,000 words. Maybe it might have been less than that. So there wasn't very much room to describe either the details of the empirical work or to give much of a kind of in-depth ethical discussion. So a lot of the like all of the kind of methods and the details of the empirical work that we did was in the supplementary materials, but there was no kind of supplementary materials for a more in-depth ethical analysis. So that just doesn't kind of exist in relation to this paper. So this went out to review, and it went to 3 different reviewers, and they had expertise across kind of risk perception, uncertainty communication, public health ethics. Another reviewer was another person who was an expert in communication. And the reviews were kind of typical, and there were lots of helpful comments, and there were things about the methods, and there were suggestions for additional literature that we should look at and those kinds of things. But one thing that came up that was a bit of a sticking point was the claim by one of the reviewers that by saying that public health communicators were often failing to meet the standards that honesty requires, we were accusing organizations like the NHS and the CDC, whose websites we were looking at as part of this work, of being dishonest. And they suggested that this could be legally problematic. And they said that these kinds of claims were merely opinion and they weren't defensible fact. And they also kind of separately said that the writing was passionate, which the way they phrased it, they kind of sounded like they weren't trying to present it as a criticism, but I would probably take it as a bit of a criticism. And that the language we used was incendiary. So I was possibly slightly taken aback by this. I hadn't received these kinds of responses previously. But anyway, we revised the manuscript, and we had some kind of back and forths with the editor, and I think we probably did maybe 3 or even 4 revisions in the end to this paper. And the thing that kept coming back to us was use of the word honesty. So the editor was actually editing our manuscript directly by this point, and they were deleting every instance of the word honesty from the manuscript, and in some cases just replacing it with the word transparency. So I think this was an instance where it was a really good job that I had a co-author on the paper, because Mihal was much more kind of relaxed about this than I was. I was getting all kind of like perhaps a bit on my high horse about carefully used rigorous philosophical terms and how you can't just swap them for other words, and it really matters what the language is here and this kind of thing. And Mihal was like, well, does it really matter? Have we said that much to justify that it's necessary to use the word honesty, and that it's not kind of equally valid to use something like transparency or to talk about it in other terms? And eventually I kind of acquiesced, and we made the changes that the editor wanted, and the paper was published. So I'm not sure whether this was an instance of kind of reasonable accommodation, or whether it was just an instance of cowardness on my part. But that was the decision that we took, and that's what we did. And kind of in hindsight, I think it wasn't particularly unreasonable. As I said, it's a very short paper. There wasn't a huge amount of space to go into depth about what the requirements of honesty are, and to draw perhaps subtle distinctions between, for instance, honesty, non-honesty, and dishonesty, and to articulate that we weren't necessarily saying that public health communicators were being dishonest if we said they weren't being honest, that they could fall into this kind of middle ground of non-honesty. And so there wasn't room for all of that discussion. So perhaps it made sense just to not use that language at all, given that it was causing such a problem, or that it was such a kind of roadblock to getting it published in this journal. We did publish another paper that drew on some of the same empirical work, and the experience of this was quite a contrast to the first paper. So we submitted this much longer paper. I think it's kind of more in the 7,000 or 8,000 word range, to Public Health Ethics, which is a kind of as it sounds like, a journal that publishes work on public health ethics, mostly by philosophers, but also by clinicians and others. And they do publish some empirical work as well, but a much smaller, more specialist journal. And this paper was submitted with the title "A Taxonomy of Non-Honesty in Public Health Communication." And in it, we outlined a number of different kind of practices or tools of public health communication. And we compared them to philosophical concepts that look very unlikely to be consistent with honesty. So we talked about the concept of deception, or the concept of paltering, which is misleading by telling the truth, or the concept of bullshitting, which is saying things with an indifference towards whether or not they're true. And we suggested that at least a lot of the public health communication practices that we describe are at risk of crossing over into to failures of non-honesty. So we avoided making the stronger argument, which was to claim that they're necessarily non-honest or dishonest, but we suggested that there was a risk, and that each instance of the use of these kinds of practices needed some kind of careful attention in order to try and understand whether or not they were meeting the standards of honesty or not. So the things we were talking about were things like magnitude neglect. So this is failing to provide a numerical or quantitative effect size when you talk about benefits and harm. mismatched reporting. So this is the thing I described where you pair relative risks with absolute risks and kind of exaggerate the difference between the two. Uncertainty laundering, so failing to give an indication of the uncertainty associated with particular health claims. So this is particularly important when things are very uncertain, when science is in a very early stage. Causation laundering, so implying causation when really the evidence only supports conclusions about correlation. So these were the kinds of things that we were discussing in this paper. And the experience with this was a kind of a very typical one. So again, we got quite lengthy reviewer comments, and they were complaining about various things that we'd done and how terrible our writing was and all those things, but we were allowed to revise and resubmit. But there was no suggestion that there would be any kind of legal concerns about publishing this work. There were perhaps suggestions that we hadn't managed to justify the ethical claims that we were making, but there wasn't a suggestion that was in principle impossible because it was, these are mere opinions and they're not defensible facts or those kinds of things. There was no suggestion that the language was too passionate or too emotional, in contrast to the criticisms of the Nature Human Behavior reviewers. So it was quite different. So what do I make of all this? Well, I think one thing that this experience might have highlighted, one thing it might suggest, is that honesty itself is perhaps a particularly sensitive or difficult topic to discuss, that it maybe raises issues of legality or a lack of objectivity, those kinds of things. So it could be that the honesty itself is difficult to discuss in scientific arenas. It might reflect an issue more broadly. We're talking about kind of ethical concepts or providing ethical arguments in scientific outlets or in relation to scientific practices like public health communication, particularly if there's a widespread view that ethical argumentation is mere opinion, that the conclusions drawn can't be justified because there are no facts in this arena. One other thing that it kind of flagged was that it's quite difficult to articulate friendly criticisms of practices like public health communication. So what we didn't want to do here really was to kind of slag off public health communicators and tell them that they were terrible people and that they were doing everything wrong. What we wanted to do was really to encourage reflection upon really common practices and to encourage them to look closely at behavior that they kind of take for granted and think is very unproblematic, and to reconsider it in light of discussions of honesty and the ethics of communication, to see if there are better ways of doing it. And I think maybe we could have done a better job of kind of articulating our concerns more carefully and not coming across as being too critical or too attacking. But certainly the responses we received suggested it was seen as an attack, and it was seen as perhaps kind of personally critical of public health communicators. So it suggests that one needs to be very careful when doing this kind of work. So my overall impression was that it's definitely worth trying to publish kind of ethical and perhaps philosophical work in kind of broader science journals, and to try and engage people who work in those disciplines with these kinds of discussions. But it's unfortunate that it seems to get kind of sidelined into work that has a very shaky epistemic status, and work that is seen as kind of perhaps emotional or too provocative or too legally risky. And that seems to me like a real shame for the prospects of progress in these kinds of areas, and actually changing scientific research for the better and doing interdisciplinary work in this way. So that's really all that I was I wanted to talk about, and I'd be really interested to hear, to field any questions that people have, but also to hear people's views and experiences on this, and whether they think that whether they think that I'm just whinging and that this is there are no problems here, and it was all fine, which, you know, I accept that's possibly the case, or whether people think that there is room for improvement here in terms of publication practices and the openness of scientific journals to publishing more ethical research. Okay, thank you very much.
We have about 15 minutes for questions.
Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yep, okay. I want to defend the reviewers a little bit. So your study showed that the science communication was inaccurate, but showing that it's dishonest is a higher bar, because there's lots of ways you can be inaccurate without being dishonest, right? So if the reporters sincerely believed it, that's not dishonest. If they wrote it, then editors changed the words, that's not dishonest. If they had some excuses, maybe the organisation is under constraints, that's not dishonest. And so it seemed like you were saying it was inaccurate and therefore dishonest, but actually, like, it seems like we needed much more information before that could be established. So why did you want to say this writing is dishonest as opposed to inaccurate?
Yeah, thanks. So I think we have a few examples of the kind of strongest case for non-honesty, and I think what we wanted to argue wasn't that this was definitely not honest or dishonest. And you can't say it with certainty anyway, because if honesty or dishonesty requires some intention to deceive or to distort the facts, then it's very difficult, perhaps impossible, to really prove what someone's intention is, insofar as you can't get inside their brain and see what they were thinking or what they were intending, right? So you're relying on kind of surrogate evidence of what their intentions are. So you have to do a bit of filling in, but we're in the arena of kind of plausibility and likelihood here, I think, rather than certainty. And this is exactly what the reviewers were kind of concerned about, and actually the reviewers of the more philosophical argument were pushing back on this as well. They were saying you can't prove this, you can't prove that their intention was to mislead, and that's true. But I think that in some cases you can say it's very plausible that there was an intention to mislead here. And so I think the strongest cases for that are where you've got this mismatched reporting. So where the communicator is providing absolute risks, they are providing frequency information, but they're only using that when they're talking about the harms of the recommended intervention. So they're using it, they're using the very small number to talk about the bad effects of what they think you should do. And they're using the relative risk to talk about the good effects of what they think you should do. And they're using those things both together. So they're pairing them together. So you get this, halves your risk of cardiovascular disease. Oh, and it comes along with this very small 0.0001% chance of, this other particular harm. So I think mismatched reporting is one of the instances where it looks like there might be an intention to mislead there. There's an intention to kind of mislead people about how serious the harms are or how important the benefits are. There's also, now this isn't in the paper, but just my analysis of the public health communication that we read. The way that language is used is often seems to belie an intention just to kind of persuade people to do the thing that the communicator thinks they should do. So the NHS webpage on the benefits of exercise is being updated now, but at the time we extracted these health claims, the page said, roll up, it's the miracle cure we've all been waiting for. If exercise was a pill, every doctor would be prescribing it. So there are these very kind of bold claims about the benefits of exercise, and they weren't specific. They weren't in relation to the particular effects that exercise might have on mental well-being or reducing mild to moderate depression or things like that. They were just kind of like, this is brilliant. Exercise is absolutely wonderful for your health. Now, I know lots of people think it probably is, but the empirical evidence supporting the benefits of exercise isn't at a stage where we can really make those kinds of very strong claims, right? Like, it's very difficult to get good evidence on the benefits of exercise over a whole lifetime. And because of the problems with confounds where people who are in good health are much more likely to exercise than people who are in bad health, it's really quite difficult to kind of tease these causal effects apart. So that kind of an example isn't in our data set because we weren't doing a kind of qualitative analysis. But it certainly makes me as a researcher and me as a member of the public who consumes public health information kind of think that there is an intention here behind public health communications. There is an intention to kind of just get people to do what their healthy behavior is rather than to create really well-informed citizens about their health. Now, there's another discussion to be had about what the justified goals of public health communication are and whether it's actually fine for public health communicators to do that. But I don't think we should quibble too much about whether or not that's like completely honest in terms of really trying to present an accurate picture of what the evidence looks like.
Oh, go ahead.
Oh, hi, Rebecca. I love the talk. This is kind of a follow-up on this last question. I can't remember if I brought it up last year, so I apologize if I've asked it before. But there's this interesting question about what it means to be honest in this situation when there is an intention, and that intention could be for the audience to walk away with an accurate gist of the evidence. And right, so like, I think something that public communicators are doing is they're trying to adjust for behavioral biases, right? So if we know that humans overweight harms and underweight benefits, if I'm trying to get them to arrive at an accurate understanding, I might frame information in this mismatched way. So that, right, the intention is actually, I don't want them to attend too much to the harms because I know that that's the normal bias people have. And I'm curious what your reaction to that is, because that seems like a plausible reason people would do this mismatching, which is it is very intentional, and it's intentional to the extent it's trying to get people to believe the evidence in a certain way, but not necessarily in a dishonest way.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, Emma. So I think this gets described as an altruistic lie. So altruistic lies are instances where you say something that is not true with the intention of causing the recipient to form a true belief. So if I know that you think that red is black and black is red, then I'll say, the car out there is black, even though I know it's red, because I want you to form the understanding that there's a car out there of a particular pigment that you call black for some reason, but is actually red. Red is the term that everyone else uses. So is that an instance of honesty? Yeah, I think it could well be. I think you're not intentionally distorting the facts when you do that. I think you're trying to provide a non-distorted communication of what the facts are. So is that what's going on in these cases of public health communication? Well, I think sometimes at least public health communicators probably think that's what they're doing, and they might justify to themselves and others their practices when they're doing it. I think that's possible. I don't know how robust the evidence is that they are doing that successfully. So I'm aware of work on cognitive biases and kind of underweighting small probabilities or overweighting probabilities. I kind of appreciate that there's a rich area of research here, which is important if you're going to make attempts to provide information in subtly misleading ways in order to produce true beliefs in people. And it might be possible to to finesse that in a way that's successful. But I'm skeptical as to whether or not we can do that reliably, and as to whether or not that's a good idea, whether that's actually defensible. So it seems to me that there's some risk that those kinds of biases, maybe they arise some of the time, maybe they arise in the majority of people, but not in everyone. Like not everyone's going to display that bias. Saying is truthful according to normal standards of truth, rather than these kind of cognitive bias adjusted standards of truth. Yes, I think it probably is, and I also think that that's safer, and just in terms of this kind of communication, where it's written communication, it's numerical communication, at least some of the time, you need to be able to defend it according to those kind of ordinary standards of truthfulness, as opposed to, oh, well, I thought that you would probably overestimate this chance of harm, so I kind of dumbed it down a little bit. And I think it's revealing that if this was a clinical encounter, so if you were talking to a doctor one-to-one, if they did that to you, if they gave you risk information that was kind of inaccurate in some way in order to try and get you to make the right decision or to have a better approximation of the truth, then I think that would be really troubling. And I think they would be criticizable, and they probably would be criticized for it if you were to make a complaint. So I think that is maybe revealing. Do I have anything else to say? I also kind of just don't believe that's really what they're doing. So this is an aside, and this is an impression I get. But from talking to clinicians and to talking to people who work broadly in public health, before I put these kinds of criticisms to them, they're often quite like, oh, well, people just don't get it, and they don't want that information, they don't need that information, they just need some guidance, or it's just really important that people exercise, and they don't really get how important that is, so it doesn't really matter, we just need to tell them that exercise is great. And it's only when you start making these claims about, well, is that really honest, is that a problem, that then the defense turns into, oh yeah, it is honest because people have these cognitive biases. So it starts off as quite a paternalistic thing, and then when honesty comes into it, it kind of turns into this, oh no, I'm not being paternalistic, I'm actually being like perfectly honest, and this is completely consistent with people making well-informed decisions. It's just that they can't process this information correctly. So I also have this kind of feeling that I just don't buy that that's really what's going on behind these public health communications. That's my impression. It's not something that I can kind of support through the empirical work that we've done, but nonetheless, it is what I believe to be the case.
This is so interesting, and I really appreciate your sharing your experiences of the two journals. One thing that I'm wondering is, are you assuming competence on the part of the communicators, and is that reasonable? Is that a reasonable assumption? So I'm wondering, I'm not sure who exactly these people are, or if you know from the data that you collected exactly who they are, but what sort of stats training do they have? You just mentioned biases, and that was one of the things I was thinking, because you made that distinction between knowing what the baseline is versus not knowing, and that's one of the documented biases in a bounded rationality sense. We often fail to appreciate the baseline. That could be true for these people too, I don't know. And the other thing that sort of comes to mind for me in terms of the competence question is so many others, and you may be familiar with Emily Oster, who's an economist. I don't know if you're familiar. She's written a pregnancy book, which you're now...
Yeah, I've read the pregnancy book.
Well, I was going to say there's a parenting book. But her claim was sort of a similar concern of she couldn't get the information she wanted as a pregnant person, and as an economist she had an excellent econometric skill set which she applied to the research to come to her own conclusions. So what do you think about competence here?
Yeah, that's a really great question, and I think perhaps in discussing honesty, we were being over optimistic about the skill set of the people producing the communication. I actually don't know. I don't know who's writing it. So the websites we were looking at, they were being produced, like quite a lot of them. You can imagine, like, it was the top hits on Google. So a lot of the time it was coming from the NHS or the CDC or research charities. So Cancer Research UK is a very big one over here. So you would kind of hope that they're on top of the data and they're on top of the evidence, but the actual people who are writing the language for the websites, I don't know if they necessarily are. Since kind of publishing this work, I have talked to my sister-in-law, works in communications in a very different capacity, and I kind of understood a bit more about how that works, and that the kind of communications professionals are given a brief by the client, and so maybe the people who are writing the language are not experts in this area, and they're kind of relying upon the clients, be they the NHS or Cancer Research UK or something, to make sure that information is accurate. And those people might not think it's their job to edit the communications too heavily. So perhaps there's a situation where the people with the expertise don't think it's their job to change it, and the people without the expertise don't realize that there's a problem going on. So yeah, I think that's fair. I think that could be a defense of some form. In terms of the just lack of data on this stuff, I think that often is a big problem. Like we don't have good evidence for loads of the kinds of health claims that we would like to be able to make relating to the kinds of behaviors and health states that we were looking at. But I don't think that provides that much of an excuse for failures of honesty here. So I think that they should be much more upfront about the lack of certainty, and be much more qualified and hesitant when making these kinds of public health claims. There sometimes seems to be an assumption that people won't pay attention or they won't do anything unless they're given an indication of kind of certainty and a great deal of confidence. And actually, that's not what my reading of risk communication literature suggests you should do. Like, it suggests you should actually be you can be quite clear about uncertainty. People don't just completely dismiss any claims that are qualified with uncertainty. They perhaps lower their trust in those claims, but that's probably justified given that there is uncertainty. So if there are instances where there just isn't any data, we don't know what the effect of a particular intervention on someone's health is, then we shouldn't make it up. Like, we shouldn't be saying stuff. And there's quite frustrating things that the NHS website does quite often, where they'll say things about drinking ginger tea or having ginger snaps when you're when you're pregnant, if you're suffering from nausea. And then they'll say there isn't really any evidence that this helps, but some people like to do it. And I think that's kind of wild coming from the NHS and like someone that's supposedly providing you with evidence-based advice. And they're just like, oh, here's this thing that there's no evidence it works, but some people think it works anyway. Like, don't tell me that. So yeah, I think it's a real challenge for public health work, health promotion, and public health communication. And I don't want to suggest that it's in any way easy to get the underlying information, but I don't think that it really justifies kind of communicating overconfident claims anyway.
All right, I think we're going to cut questions there, but thank you so much for your questions, and thank you, Rebecca.